This is the Music History Today podcast for December the 8th. On today's show, the world loses John Lennon and Dimebag Darrell, and Traffic releases their debut album. First up, though, on this date in 1813, classical composer Ludwig van Beethoven premiered his 7th Symphony in A in Vienna, Austria. In 1849, classical composer Giuseppe Verdi premiered the opera Luisa Miller in Naples. In 1925, the musical comedy The Coconuts opened at the Lyric Theater on Broadway for 276 performances. In 1949, the musical Gentlemen Prefer Blondes from Jules Stein and starring Carol Channing premiered at the Ziegfeld Theater on Broadway for 740 performances. In 1957, the musical special The Sound of Jazz, with performances by Billie Holiday, Count Basie, and Thelonious Monk, premiered on CBS television. In 1962, DJ Alan Freed took the stand at his payola trial in New York City and admitted that he received money from record labels in exchange for playing their songs on air. He was eventually found guilty, given 6 months probation, and had to pay $300, and his career was essentially over after that. In 1963, Frank Sinatra Jr. was kidnapped in Lake Tahoe, Nevada. He was freed 3 days later after his father, Frank Sinatra of course, paid the $240,000 ransom. The men who kidnapped Sinatra Jr. were later captured and sent to prison. In 1968, Graham Nash played his last concert with the Hollies. It was at the London Palladium at a Save the Children benefit concert. In 1971, Elton John officially changed his name from Reginald Dwight. In 1975, Gary Thane of Uriah Heep passed away at the age of 27. In 1976, the Barbra Streisand-Kris Kristofferson version of the movie A Star is Born premiered in movie theaters. Also in 1976, the Carpenters' first TV special, The Carpenters' Very First Special, premiered on television. In 1977, a riot broke out at a Blondie concert in Brisbane, Australia, when Blondie didn't show up to play. In 1980, John Lennon was assassinated by Mark David Chapman at the age of 40. We go into this whole sad event and what led up to the whole thing, and also a couple other stories that are on here, including Dimebag Darrell, on this week's Music History In-Depth podcast, which has dropped on this network. In 1980, photographer Annie Leibovitz became the last photographer to do a photo shoot with John Lennon, as he was assassinated that very evening. In 1982, country music singer Marty Robbins passed away from complications from surgery at the age of 57. In 1984, Vince Neil of Motley Crue was the driver of a car that was involved in a car accident which killed his passenger, 24-year-old Razzle Digley of the band Hanoi Rocks, and seriously injured the occupants of the car that Vince hit in a head-on collision. Razzle was 24 years old. Vince was found to have had a blood alcohol reading of 0.17, which was higher than the California legal limit of 0.10. He was charged with driving under the influence and vehicular manslaughter, for which he was ordered to pay $2.6 million in restitution to the living victims and to serve only 30 days in jail, plus 200 hours of community service. Vince Neil was released from prison after only serving about half those 30 days. In happier news, in 1984, Ringo Starr with musical guest Herbie Hancock hosted Saturday Night Live. In 1995, the Grateful Dead announced that they were breaking up after the death of guitarist and founding member Jerry Garcia. 3 of the former members then got back together and formed the group Dead & Company in 2015. In 1997, Metallica released their live home video, Cunning Stunts. In 1998, the FBI released its file on Frank Sinatra, who they had been watching for what turned out to be a couple decades. In 1999, the Broadway concert Minnelli on Minnelli, starring Liza Minnelli, opened at the Palace Theater for 20 performances for the holiday season. In 2004, 24 years after the death of John Lennon, Dimebag Darrell Abbott of Pantera was killed by a fan while performing on stage in 2004. Dimebag Darrell was 38 years old, and we do discuss this particular death as well on the Music History In-Depth podcast. In 2005, the K-pop group AKB48 had their first performance. In 2007, Howie Dorough of the Backstreet Boys married his wife, Leah Boniello. In 2010, Nancy Wilson of Heart divorced film director Cameron Crowe. In 2011, Sinead O'Connor married drug counselor Barry Harridge. In 2013, Metallica played a promotional gig in Antarctica. In 2019, Olga Neuwirth became the first female composer to have a work performed by the Vienna State Opera. Also in 2019, rapper Juice WRLD passed away at the age of 21. In 2022, Celine Dion announced that she had stiff person syndrome, which has made her have spasms. In award ceremonies that were held on December the 8th, in 1993, Whitney Houston was among the big winners at the Billboard Music Awards. In 1997, the Spice Girls and LeAnn Rimes were among the big winners at the Billboard Music Awards. In 1999, the Backstreet Boys, Creed, and Britney Spears were among the big winners at the Billboard Music Awards. And to complete the Billboard Music Award trend for this date, in 2004, it was Usher, Toby Keith, and Alicia Keys who were among the big winners at the Billboard Music Awards. Albums that were released on December the 8th include in 1967 when the Beatles released their huge album, Magical Mystery Tour, but only in the UK on that date. Also in 1967, Traffic released their debut album, Mr. Fantasy, only in the UK on that date. And also in 1967, the Rolling Stones released their Satanic Majesty's Request, and you guessed it, only in the UK on that date. Meanwhile, in America in 1972, Lou Reed released Transformer, and Marvin Gaye released the soundtrack to the movie Trouble Man. In 1973, Roxy Music released Stranded. In 1976, the Eagles released one of the biggest selling albums in America of all time. In fact, it sits somewhere around number 6 or 7 on the list, Hotel California. In 1978, Public Image Limited, or PIL, if you were, released their debut album, Public Image, First Issue. And yeah, it was only in the UK on that date. In 1980, Queen released the soundtrack to Flash Gordon. In 1986, Tesla released Mechanical Resonance. In 1987, Kool Moe Dee released How You Like Me Now. In 1992, Utah Saints released their self-titled album. In 1993, The Verve Pipe released Pop Smear. In 1997, Catatonia released their EP, Sounds of Decay. In 2009, 30 Seconds to Mars released This Is War, and Jimmy Buffett released Buffett Hotel. In 2016, Childish Gambino, a.k.a. Donald Glover, released Awaken My Love. In 2017, the soundtrack to the movie The Greatest Showman was released. And also on that same date, Johnny Mathis released a 67-disc box set called The Voice of Romance, the Columbia Original Album Collection, which had 67 remastered albums and 2 albums that hadn't been released before. And in 2023, Nicki Minaj released Pink Friday 2, Electric Boogaloo. Just kidding on the Electric Boogaloo part, that's an 80s reference. Anywho, and The Killers released Rebel Diamonds. Singles that were released on December the 8th include in 1965 when the Mamas and the Papas released their classic, California Dreamin'. In 1979, Dan Fogelberg released his big hit, Longer. In 1984, Triumph released Follow Your Heart. In 1992, Madonna released her hit, Deeper and Deeper. 1997 was the date that Celine Dion sang about that ship that went down. Of course, that's My Heart Will Go On, the love theme from Titanic. In 2008, Taylor Swift released White Horse. And in 2009, Jason Derulo released In My Head. Before we continue, we'd like to tell you that we've started Season 2 of the Music History In-Depth podcast, where we go more in-depth on some of the events that we mention on this particular podcast. The Music History In-Depth podcast drops every Tuesday on this podcast network. Now, back to the Music History Today podcast. Artists who were born on December the 8th, and there's some legends in here. First off, the legendary, iconic Mr. Sammy Davis Jr., tap dancer, actor, singer, Las Vegas residency mainstay, and also, of course, a member of the Rat Pack with Sinatra, Dean Martin, etc. Also, the iconic Mr. Jim Morrison of the group The Doors. Also, the legend that she was, and still is, the late great Miss Sinead O'Connor. Also, rapper Nicki Minaj, country music singer Sam Hunt, Marty Friedman of Megadeth, Greg Allman of the Allman Brothers Band, another icon, Ray Shulman of Gentle Giant, Graham Knight of Marmalade, Bobby Elliott of the Hollies, composer Jean Sibelius, Jerry Butler of The Impressions, Mike Botts of Bread, Paul Rutherford of Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Phil Collins of Def Leppard, not to be confused with Phil Collins, singer Dan Hartman of I Can Dream About You fame, Warren Cucurullo, who replaced John Taylor for an album in Duran Duran, Ryan Newell of Sister Hazel, rapper Bushwick Bill of the Ghetto Boys, Jeff Daking of Blues Magoos, Richie Morales of Spyro Gyra, Jimmy Farrar of Molly Hatchet, George Baker of the George Baker Selection, jazz musician Jimmy Smith, Western swing singer Floyd Tillman, singer Dick Glaser, Toots Hibbert of Toots and the Maytals, Wawa Watson of Motown's Funk Brothers backup band, bassist Nathan East, guitarist Greg Howe, Corey Taylor of Slipknot, singer Serena Ryder, rapper Nia Kay, singer Pee-wee, singer Aaliyah Kolf, and singer Ingrid Michaelson. And if you think a lot of people were doing something about 9 months prior, you would be correct. Artists who unfortunately passed away on December the 8th, other than the ones mentioned earlier, include musicologist Dom Pothier, pianist Xavier Schwarenka, pianist Alexander Solodi, jazz pianist Richard M. Jones, musicologist Jacques Hanskrim, John Mills Sr. of the Mills Brothers, jazz critic Hughes Panacea, harmonica player Big Walter, Tubo Road of the Persuasions, singer Pony Metcalf, jazz trumpet player Buck Clayton, singer-songwriter Antonio Jabim, pianist Ruben Gonzalez of the Buena Vista Social Club, singer Martha Tilton, organist Dick Sims, rockabilly musician Bonnie Lou, opera singer Matawilda Dobbs, pianist Harold Budd, jazz pianist Barry Harris, Ralph Tavares of Tavares, and Robbie Shakespeare of the group Sly and Robbie. Next on the Music History Today podcast, it is December the 9th, when in 2012, singer Jenny Rivera passed away in a plane accident.